Well, it's hard to talk about the lasting effects of WikiLeaks without also talking about Private First Class Bradley Manning. Manning is accused of leaking many of those classified cables to WikiLeaks. Now, even though he was arrested 2.5 years ago, Manning is just now having his pre-trial hearing, despite a law in the military that says court-martial should come within 120 days of being detained. Now, at first, Manning was held for about 3 months in Kuwait, then transferred in July 2010 to the Marine Corps base at Quantico in Virginia, where he remained for 8 months, reportedly spending all of that time in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, forced to strip naked at night. He was then moved to Fort Leavenworth, or maybe I have that backwards. Regardless, his pretrial hearing has been taking place under intense secrecy, with activists and journalists fighting to get more access. One of those journalists is our own web writer, Andrew Blake, who spent much of yesterday inside the courtroom at Fort Meade. Andrew, did I have that right? He went from Kuwait to Quantico.
Okay, and then Fort Leavenworth.
Okay,
yeah,
so I
correct.
had that right. Okay,
yes.
perfect. Well, you were there in the courtroom yesterday. Take us inside. What happened?
Well, yesterday was just the first day in the latest round of pretrial motion hearings. Of course, like you said, it's been, like 930 days, I think, at this point, since he was first picked up. And, of course, the trial should have started within 120 or so. But here we are.
The court-martial should have, which isn't even scheduled until February
That'll start
of 2013.
in February,
right?
and if it wraps up in March when it's supposed to, we'll be at around day 1,000 by then. So, but this week, the hearings that we're having this week are really important because they are going to focus on what Bradley experienced while he was at Quantico in Northern Virginia. So that's where he was kept for around 8 or 9 months, and that's where, for upwards of 23 hours a day, they took away his clothes, they made him sit in a 6-foot by 8-foot room, and subjected him to conditions that the UN said were pretty much on par with torture. So we're expected to actually hear Manning speak this week to talk about the things that we've only heard through his attorney in the months since. So this is going to be a really important week to actually humanize this case and actually hear from the man himself what it was like being forced.
Right, because if I'm not mistaken, I mean, we have not heard anything from him since he's been arrested.
No, not from the occasional, yes, ma'am, in court. And aside from that, we haven't really heard anything yet.
Were you able to see, Andrew, when you were in court, were you able to understand how Bradley Manning was doing, his mood? There was concern for a long time that it was affecting his mental health.
I mean, I can only begin to try to start to imagine what it must be like to be him, especially after hearing testimony yesterday. David Coombs, Manning's defense attorney, was grilling, I believe his name is Colonel Dan Choike, who was a commanding officer at Quantico Brig, where Manning was stuck for 9 months. And we learned a lot about the mismanagement at Quantico and a lot about how it seemed like a living hell for Private Manning. And but based off of that, what I've heard in the media and through my own reporting, I really didn't expect to be face-to-face with a person who looks like a healthy, young 24-year-old military private. But sure enough, Private Manning was standing right next to me for a while, and I didn't even recognize him because I have no idea what it must be like to actually be inside of his person and have gone through years of this at this point, but I didn't recognize him because he was actually smiling and actually seemed cheerful and actually seemed to be in a somewhat healthy place at this point. And then sure enough,
probably to an extent a little happy to be surrounded by people, and also to finally get this game moving.
There was actually a packed courthouse yesterday. The amount of supporters from the public that were there had filled up the whole public section and had to go into the media overflow area. So people can go to these hearings at Fort Meade. They can go all week and they can hear hopefully from Manning himself, who is scheduled. At this rate, they're thinking maybe tomorrow or perhaps Friday he'll be in there.
And of course, after Bradley Manning was first arrested, and those reports started coming out that he was actually being held in solitary confinement. I know I got the chance to sit down with Juan Mendez, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, and at that time he was still sort of investigating what was going on. But he did later release a report in which he said, without mincing his words, he said, accused the U.S. government of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. Now, we talked not just about Manning, but about some of the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, and really about the way that the U.S. government views torture. I want to play a little bit of what he said.
I don't think these are crimes that can be swept under the rug and pretend that they didn't happen. And if that's for people who think that that will enhance the reputation of the United States abroad, that's exactly the opposite of what will happen. The United States insists on all other countries to live up to their human rights obligations, and one of them is to investigate torture. And so I think this has to happen here as well.
So to what extent do you think, Andrew, that Bradley Manning's case is actually raising awareness about, prisoners who are held in military custody?
And we're only really going to see the awareness level go up when the media starts reporting on it. But luckily, we're actually seeing a lot of media in the court this week. Perhaps it's because we're actually getting to a pivotal point in the case where we're finding out from Private Manning himself what's happening. But like I said, during these testimonies where they're grilling Colonel Chokey from Quantico and reading emails from the top brass within the military who were involved with his stationing there, you can see that this wasn't necessarily an isolated incident. In fact, months earlier, there was a U.S. soldier who was detained at Quantico who committed suicide. And that was one of the reasons, allegedly, that they were trying to really keep an eye on Manning. Even if he wasn't suicidal, they wanted to impose every rule that they could on him to make sure that he didn't do anything that could possibly harm himself or Quantico's reputation.
It seems like there's a lot of twists and turns in this case. What do you think has been the most surprising so far?
Well, I wouldn't say surprising, but the real eye-opener here is the gross mismanagement at Quantico and probably to a greater extent the entire Pentagon. When Colonel Chokey was on the stand yesterday, it seemed like every time that the defense counsel would present him with a fact, something that came from one of his own emails or something that came from Manning himself, he really, time and time again, didn't know what was going on. He said, well, we went through the chain of command. Well, this person said this and this person said that. And at one point, he kept driving home the fact that, well, I may have the responsibility to look over Private Manning, but I don't have the authority. But then, of course, Coombs managed to tell him, well, no, you do have the authority, and got him to admit it himself, too.
And wasn't there something about, in this case, about, in fact, instead of a psychologist,
yes, absolutely. Instead of a forensic psychiatrist to assess Manning's mental health while he was stationed at Quantico, initially the officers there relied on a dentist for health updates for Private Manning, which is something I've heard earlier, but the groans in the courtroom and in the meeting room yesterday during that part,
wow.
Golly.
I mean, just one example of what seems to be a host of many.
I think we're going to find out a lot more this week, though. So.
All right,
we'll
RT
see.
Web producer Andrew Blake, thanks so much.
Okay.